Okay, while we are accepting the late arrivals, I would like to give everybody a brief update on what has been going on at the Severn River Association since our last John Wright speaker series, which was in May with the very talented Alex Pellegrini. If any of you missed that, please head over to our website where you can see the recording on his talk about osprey restoration. But since May, a lot has been going on at Severn River Association. Uh, on the oysters front, we planted 23 million oysters over the course of the summer. A lot of that started in June with those of you who contributed to the Green Give, allowing us to raise the money to plant 9 million spat on shell in our sanctuary reef. Later that same month, our Marylanders Grow Oysters participants started to plant their oysters in the sanctuary, and we estimated the total at about 1 million oysters through that program. If you aren't a member of the Marylanders Grow Oysters program, but you live on the water and would like to join, please email us. You can email our restoration associate, Molly, who is here on this Zoom, MOLLIE at severnriver.org. And then in August, we piloted our direct setting procedure and planted 13 million larvae directly onto a sanctuary reef. And we will be diving those areas in the spring to see what sort of survival rates we got. Elsewhere in restoration world, we completed a stormwater management project in the Georgetown East community in Annapolis. We also received funding for a living shoreline in the Wardour community and another living shoreline in the Fairwinds on Severn up in the headwaters. We also received funding for design of stormwater management facilities along Genesee Street, close to the Naval Academy Stadium here in Annapolis. And we got funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to do an action plan for Severn Run section number 2 up in the headwaters of the river. On the staffing front, we brought in a new Chesapeake Conservation and Climate Corps member, Erin Hamner, who we're really excited to have with us for a year. She started in August, so hopefully you'll see her around at some of our public events. And speaking of public events, this weekend is a really fun one that is new for Severn River Association, which is the Lifeline 100 ride, where SRA will be a beneficiary of a fun ride for all skill levels. There's 15 miles, 30 miles, 65, and a full century for those experienced cyclists among you. I'm dropping the link for registration in the chat. I hope that if you would like to get out on your bike, even for a family fun ride, it starts and ends at Kinder Park. Registrations, we'd like you to register by Thursday if you can for this weekend's ride, and the ride's going to be on Sunday. So far, the weather looks great, so we hope you can join us there. Those are all the updates, and I am going to pass it off in a minute to our board member, Brian Gomes, who's the chair of the Adult Education Committee. I'm really excited about our upcoming speaker. This is somebody that we have been in touch with for a while and waited all summer long to hear from, but I will pass it off to Brian to give her introduction. Thank you all for joining us. Brian?
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. One more bit of news. Our next speaker series will be next month on Wednesday, October 29th. And the topic will be on lighthouses. If anyone was part of our talk, it was during the pandemic, and it was also an online format like this. It was very well attended. So stay tuned for news coming up, but that will be Wednesday, October 29th for the next John Wright speaker series. So on to the main event this evening. Dr. Jamie Goodall is a historian and U.S. Army Center with the U.S. Army Center for Military History in Washington, D.C. She has a PhD in history from The Ohio State University and specializations in Atlantic World, Early American, and military histories. She has many publications and has appeared on programs like Mysteries from Above and History Channel's History's Greatest Mysteries. And this evening, we're going to learn about piracy and privateering from the Golden Age from 1650 to 1730, including pillaging and plundering pirates from Baltimore to the Hampton Roads. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Goodall.
So much. And you even got the into the Ohio State.
My sister went to the George Washington University, so I know the nuances of those few universities.
Say the Ohio State. And I'm like, I'm not from Ohio. I just went. Oh, thank you all so much for being here tonight and for your flexibility. I know this was originally an in-person talk. Lots of things going on, and I'm sure if you're keeping up with the news, I'm a federal employee, so things are a little tense right now. So whether or not I'll be working tomorrow. But tonight, we're going to take our minds off that and talk about pirates. And so one of the things that I like to sort of start with is how we get to the Chesapeake Bay. Because when we think of pirates, we tend to envision the swashbucklers of that so-called golden age of the 17th and 18th centuries. But, you know, in essence, pirates have existed well before these buccaneers arrived on the scene. And in fact, they've existed essentially for as long as people have sailed the world's waters. The earliest recorded instances of piracy we have occurred in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas in the 14th century BCE, so many, many eons ago. And one such inscription we have that really stood out to me when I was doing some of my research is from Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III, which really detailed his establishment of defenses along the Nile Delta against commerce raiders. And part of the reason that we see piracy develop so early in this particular region really has a lot to do with its geography. The area really limited agricultural production to a very specific area along the Nile itself. And as a result, a lot of people, particularly along the coastlines of Northern Africa, turned to maritime trades to make a living and to bring sustenance. So fishing, gathering mollusks, seaweed, salt, etc. Of course, ships in the 14th century BCE couldn't really sail long distances over open waters, so shipping was limited to these few navigable routes that largely stuck pretty close to the coastline, which was really beneficial to Mediterranean raiders because the ruggedness of the coast with its numerous inlets provided them cover from merchant ships until it was too late for those vessels to evade attack. And so what we see essentially is pirates raiding these commercial vessels with relative impunity from Lebanon to Greece, Egypt to Rome until about the 5th century BCE. Around that point, we really see a more concerted effort by the Roman Empire to put a stamp on these commerce raiders. And so it's not really until the rise of the Roman Empire that we have this successful concerted effort to eradicate piracy. The word pirate actually comes from ancient Greek, and I probably butcher this every time I say it because I don't speak ancient Greek, but peromai, which means attempt. And in the context of this means in the attempt to steal. It evolves, of course, into the more modern Greek piratis, and then the Latin word pirata, and gets anglicized and changed over the years. But that's where we get the term. But what we see then, all the way from the 14th century BCE to this time period that we're going to be talking about, is that official cooperation between leaders and pirates has a really long and sordid history. And setting up the context for Golden Age pirates and the pirates that operated in the Chesapeake specifically, the tales of the Elizabethan sea dogs provide us with that very interesting account for how piracy will ultimately develop in this so-called New World. Now the Sea Dogs, the name was bestowed upon them by the Spanish. It was not a name that they took on themselves, because according to the Spanish, the English pirates, as they referred to them, of course the English thought they were privateers, the Spanish said the English were no better than mongrels doing their master's bidding. So that's where this sea dog term comes from. But they're commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century to augment the English naval presence in the region. And they really play a major role in the development of the English Atlantic. And of course, the Spanish largely are who these Elizabethan sea dogs target, because the Spanish and the Portuguese had long had a head start on their colonization efforts compared to the English. Now, two things sort of separate the sea dogs and these other privateers from legal pirates, right? Like the legal definition of piracy. And this is a very simplistic view because the law gets really tricky, but essentially it depends on your perspective and whether or not you have a letter of marque or a commission. And part of that, the perspective, of course, is one man's privateer. So the English viewed these as privateers who had legal status. But from the perspective of the Spanish, of course, they're pirates. So your perspective has a bit to do with how you view people. And then the letter of marque. And of course, in the English, a letter required in advance. Attempts to regulate piracy in that Elizabethan era were half-hearted at best. And so it was better to ask forgiveness than permission. And it was not uncommon for the English crown at that time to retroactively issue letters of marque, especially if the privateer's actions or the person's actions were beneficial economically to the crown. And so as long as these sea dogs are attacking foreign ships, the crown tended to sort of overlook that missing letter of marque. And this is particularly true in England's West Country among the gentry and local officials. I think that's one of the really interesting things about the Elizabethan sea dogs versus the pirates and privateers of the Golden Age is what echelon of society they're being drawn from. The sea dogs are largely coming from very wealthy, prominent families. And so they're already using that status to their advantage. Now, although local officials, especially in the West Country, were tasked with policing piracy, they regularly released suspected pirates or really failed to apprehend them in the first place. And so in the eyes of many English men and women, the Sea Dogs' actions were considered patriotic. They were a means of promoting the Protestant religion in the face of the dastardly Catholics of Spain, France, and Portugal. And it supplemented this burgeoning Royal Navy. And again, this was really important to the port cities of this growing Atlantic world. Now, as the English are trying to establish a foothold in this so-called New World, again, they've got 100 years or so to catch up to the Spanish and the Portuguese. These port cities were really crucial to regional and global economies. And honestly, without piracy, those economies would not have developed in the way that they did, at least to the benefit of empire. Now, pirates, again, would not have been able to play that role, though, without the cooperation, whether that was official or implicit, between many colonial and imperial leaders in these illicit activities. Especially when we get to the rules for various colonial officials, especially colonial governors, it was their business to facilitate a balance between the empire's desires, what the monarchy and parliament wanted, as well as their own wishes, their own desires to become wealthy and become established. Then they had to balance all of that with the merchants and plantation owners in their stead. and the inhabitants of their locales. And so that's a lot of competing desires that these colonial officials had to work within. And so for many of them, they saw complicity with piratical activities as fulfilling their duties. It protected the interests of those who invested in the colonial venture. It brought goods, services, and money to various locations and helped to establish stronger economies, which furthered additional investments in the colonial venture. So it was sort of a cyclic situation. We would be remiss too not to note that pirates were also ardent participants in the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples. A lot of this, you know, for a long time, pirates were viewed as these proto-egalitarian floating democracies. And it is true that some pirates were very active in disrupting the transatlantic slave trade, freeing enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, sometimes adopting them into their crews. But many pirates also viewed enslaved peoples as commodities, just like their legitimate merchant counterparts. Additionally, we've got the issue of national trade monopolies, which often rendered trading with the ships of another empire or nation illegal. And so it sort of creates certain ports for trade to the detriment of other ports and settlements. And so that, again, there's these conflicting interests. What results in is an informal network was quite robust that helped to sustain these various colonies during times of warfare, imperial failures. Again, they're providing hard currency, commodities, and even sort of pseudo military support in the form of protection against attack, especially during the various wars of that time period. I mean, I think there were like 4 or 5 Anglo-Spanish wars, multiple Anglo-Dutch wars. The English were at war with everyone. Their naval forces were quite often preoccupied fighting the forces of their quote unquote enemy nations. And so pirates and privateers could sort of supplement as security forces for these colonies who were very worried about being invaded by the enemy. Again, one man's smuggler or pirate was another man's legitimate merchant. So then what does that mean for the Chesapeake Bay? When I was first asked to do a local history, the editor at the History Press was like, well, have you ever considered writing about pirates of the Chesapeake? And I sort of laughed because I was like, huh, pirates in the Chesapeake, that's silly. And then I researched and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many pirates in the Chesapeake. And if you think about what I mentioned about the Mediterranean with its rugged coast and all of these inlets and islets and all these places to hide, the Chesapeake Bay is actually a perfect place for pirates to operate, right? There's only one way in and out. And if you were in a smaller, faster boat than a Royal Naval vessel, for example, it was very easy for you to escape and evade capture. So when we talk about the Chesapeake Bay, I'm talking about the entirety, the full stretch from Havre de Grace, Maryland in the north to Virginia Beach, Virginia in the south, everything in between. And the very first sort of recorded instance of piracy we have in the Chesapeake Bay is the result of the actions of William Claiborne and some of his associates. And many of you, you've lived in and around the Bay, are probably pretty familiar with William Claiborne and Kent Island, but we're gonna talk a little bit about his exploits here. Claiborne himself, again, he's not some impoverished, person who is seeking riches, in order to survive. He actually was born to a family of what we would consider sort of middling means in Kent, in England. This is before there was an official sort of middle class, but he came from a family that was pretty well-to-do without being exceptionally wealthy. And he wanted a life and legacy grander than his predecessors. His father and grandfather had seized various odd opportunities in shipping and small industrial enterprises, but neither of them had ever exceeded the position of local alderman or Lord Mayor in his hometown. So when he is offered the chance to leave Kent and King's Lynn to venture to Virginia as a land surveyor in 1621, he takes it without hesitation. And of course, as a colonial official now in Virginia, Claiborne wastes no time in taking advantage of what would prove to be a very lucrative position. His office granted him a 30-pound annual salary plus fees. And probably the more important part to Claiborne was an immediate land grant of 200 acres, because money is power and land is money. So in the first few years, Claiborne manages to secure 3 additional land grants from the colony's council. And so within a few years of arriving to Virginia, he has amassed a total of about 900 acres. And I want to know how he did this, because if I could ever convince the federal government to do this, it would be fantastic. But he actually convinced the council to have his surveyor salary doubled on a retroactive basis. Basically, you've already paid me my salary and fees and, that, but I want more. So can you just pay me double and, just repay me what you've already paid me? That would be great. And they did it. And I want to know how he did that, because that sounds great. Ultimately, he works his way from surveyor to counselor to ultimately colony's Secretary of State, but his ambitions are not satisfied. In April of 1627, he is granted a commission from Sir George Yardley, who is the governor and captain general of Virginia at the time, granting Claiborne the authority to discover the, quote, remaining diverse places and parts of this kingdom of Virginia altogether unknown. Of course, it was not undiscovered, unknown. Before Europeans arrived, Kent Island and the area was inhabited by indigenous peoples for over 12,000 years. But Claiborne was entrusted to sail all matter of waterways within and around the Chesapeake Bay to establish trade relations with local indigenous populations like the Chesapeake, who were on Kent Island, where he centers his operations. And essentially what the Virginia colony is trying to do is get a foothold in the fur trade. The French have been very, very good at this. Part of that is because the French have a process of intermarrying with the indigenous populations as a means of getting legitimate access to the fur trade, but the English want in because it's very, very lucrative. So between March 1629 and May 1631, Claiborne is granted additional commissions, and ultimately he is able to settle his physical parameters for his operations within the degrees of 34 and 41. Not very good with latitude and longitude myself, but this was quite a good chunk of land for him. And again, he decides to center these operations on Kent Island, which he named after his hometown. He's very creative, with a goal of provisioning and trading along the coast from Virginia all the way to Nova Scotia. And because this seemed like a simple and profitable scheme, he had no problem securing funding from London merchants like William Cloberry. However, what should have been easy and should have been profitable was anything but. While Claiborne is in London trying to drum up additional funding, he learns that George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, was using his influence to stake out a Catholic colony just north of Virginia. Claiborne, however, is like, no way it's going to happen. We're a Protestant nation. Everything will be fine. There's no way the Catholics can get in on this. So he kept to his plan, brought over 100 men to Kent Island, was spending the entirety of 1631 building, planting, and settling. Ultimately, he gets Kent Island officially represented in the Virginia Assembly. Unfortunately for Claiborne, however, Calvert prevailed in his own venture. Although George Calvert dies in 1632, he had convinced King Charles I to grant the Calvert family a charter to settle 38 to 40 degrees of land, which was assumed by Calvert's son Cecilius, second Lord Baltimore, later that summer. And of course, a lot of this had to do with the intrigue between the fact that King Charles I was already rumored to have private Catholic sympathies because he marries the French princess Henrietta Maria, who is a Catholic princess. Now he's granted this Catholic family a charter for land. A little bit of chaos. To Claiborne's dismay, of course, this new charter technically places Kent Island, which at that point land and cattle valued at over 7,000 pounds, under the control of Maryland and the Calvert family. So it's no longer technically part of Virginia. And so what ultimately happens then is a series of territorial debates and maritime conflict, and ultimately Claiborne is sort of at the helm of this. And so this is where the piracy of the Chesapeake really begins. In 1635, an agent of Claiborne named Thomas Smith seizes a pinnace, which is a light boat, near Palmer's Island as it's heading to the colony of Maryland. And Smith carries this little boat with all of its valuable commodities and its commanders and sailors to Kent Island. Once they get to Kent Island, John Butler, who is Claiborne's brother-in-law, confiscates the goods and imprisons the boat's commanders. Now, of course, to Calvert, Claiborne's actions constituted a clear act of piracy. Acting under the direction of Claiborne, Smith and Butler have seized goods from the waters illegally. So again, seems pretty cut and dry that this is a clear act of piracy. A short time later, Claiborne sends another ship out to patrol the waters, again under the captaincy of Thomas Smith. This time, Smith is to go to Mattapony Village to establish trade with the indigenous population, as Claiborne believed was his purview, according to his earlier charters. There's only one small, maybe big, problem, and that is the village lay within the boundaries of St. Mary's, Maryland now. And so when Smith arrives to the area, Calvert's ship captains stopped him, demanded proof of his right to trade in the area. Of course, Smith produces the old charters that had been granted to Claiborne, but Calvert's captains deemed the documents either falsified or based on false information, of course, because there were new charters. So they seize the boat and arrest Smith, bringing him and his men to Maryland. After a few days, Governor Calvert's like, all right, I'm going to release you guys, but I'm keeping your boat and your stuff, which was mostly just cloth and beaver skin, but basically said, you guys have to find your own way home. Good luck. Now, of course, to Claiborne, this is the real act of piracy, and he vowed to seek revenge for his losses. And what we see then is battles like this, these little tiny skirmishes, continuing intermittently, both physical and legal, over the next few years. But things come to a head in 1637 when Thomas Smith, John Butler, and another of their associates, Edward Beckler, are arrested and detained in Maryland on accusations of sedition, piracy, and murder. Because you can never just be tried for piracy. You're always tried for sedition, piracy, and murder. Additionally, a grand inquest was held at St. Mary's to determine what precisely Claiborne's role was in all of this. And in March of 1638, Claiborne himself, even though he wasn't physically present on the boats committing these acts of piracy, he was officially charged with piracy for basically supporting and orchestrating all of this. Now, although Claiborne was spared the same fate as his associates, we know Smith and Beckler for sure were both hanged for piracy in June of 1638. Claiborne did lose his goods, his lands, his tenements, and his cattle, and ultimately his former reputation as an important Virginia official was destroyed, which for somebody like Claiborne, who really devoted his life to his appearance and to his status, I feel like he might have preferred the alternative punishment than what happened to him. And so what we see then is that these are really just the first in a series of piratical actions. They are the first recorded convictions and executions of piracy in the Chesapeake Bay, but they're certainly not going to be the last. And in many ways, what we see is Claiborne's path to piracy sort of mirrors the experiences of the hundreds of men and women, although we don't have much evidence for them, who engaged in the illicit economy of this early modern Atlantic world. Now, some of them were bored merchants in the midst of a midlife crisis, like my favorite pirate, Stede Bonnet, who sold his very profitable business in Barbados, ditched his wife and kids, and paid for a pirate crew. He bought a boat and hired a crew. Not the best way to become a pirate, but some of them were pirate hunters turned pirate, like William Kidd. But most of them are average people. They're sailors, they're merchants, they're family members. And their piratical adventures were mostly short-lived. They're drinking in taverns, investing in businesses, buying homes, and most are settling down with families. Some pirates are from the Chesapeake, while others simply used the region as a base of attack. And again, most pirates didn't start out as pirates. A lot of times we see merchant marines and sailors with the Royal Navy frequently turn pirate when given the opportunity. You know, they're pretty fed up with the constant brutal beatings, lack of pay, the restrictions of their rum rations. And in those cases, they might mutiny against their officers. If boarded by a pirate crew, then they may opt to join them as opposed to remaining with their fellow sailors. This sort of gave them an opportunity that if they were caught and tried for piracy, they would just claim they were forced to join the pirates. Some also used the Chesapeake as a marketplace for their stolen goods, because the Chesapeake colonies in particular were developed as a means to an economic end. They were all about money, money, and more money. Both Virginia and Maryland, of course, become key tobacco-producing colonies. Those profits, of course, reaped on the backs of enslaved Black and Indigenous laborers. But pirates are also playing an important role in this developing economy. You know, we know that William Claiborne's piracy was born of conflict between the inhabitants of Virginia and the settlers of Maryland over territory and resources. But the Chesapeake is also home to a tobacco trader and shipwreck salvager who both turned pirate, numerous sailors and privateers hanging up their legal hats for a life of illicit commerce, and even a Frenchman who enjoyed attacking Chesapeake merchant ships, all of whom were integral to the Chesapeake's broader development. And so I'm only going to have time to talk about a few of these. I'm going to give you two stories, if you will. The first is Richard Ingle. And I love Richard Ingle in particular because of the nickname he earned himself as a pirate. He was known as the Protestant Plunderer. Do with that name what you will. I just find it amusing. Throughout the 1630s and early 1640s, Richard Ingle made it his business to transport goods and people across the Atlantic and primarily made his money in the tobacco trade. So by all accounts, doesn't start his career as a pirate. But his fate would ultimately be sealed when the English Civil War erupted the following year. Of what the English Civil War was. But just to give you a short synopsis in case you're unfamiliar, the war was ultimately a conflict between the Roundheads of Parliament, those who supported Parliament's right to rule, and the Royalists who were loyal to King Charles I. Again, although King Charles I was an Anglican, his marriage to Catholic French Princess Henrietta Maria led to some issues. And so when the war broke out, the colonies tried to remain neutral, but they found it quite difficult to remain in a neutral status, and ultimately these colonies became quite divided. Now, the Chesapeake colonies themselves both remained loyal to the king and did their part to support him. That does not mean, however, there was not a sizable portion of the population in the Chesapeake who were supportive of Parliament. And so after the colonial officials in the Chesapeake received orders to seize the ships and goods belonging to Parliament and their so-called traitorous companies, the acting governor of Maryland, Giles Brent, immediately set about fulfilling this order. Richard Ingle, on the other hand, you know, like I said, he was raised Protestant, found himself in favor of Parliament's rejection of King Charles I's absolutist rule. And so he was very much not in line with the officials in the colonies. The first accusations levied against Richard Ingle were actually done so in an act of revenge. A man named William Hardigee was angry with Ingle for taking him to court over tobacco debts. So imagine being angry at a man who took you to court because you owed him money. You're going to accuse him of piracy instead. Maybe you should just pay your bills. But Hardigee, who had been sued many times over debt he'd incurred, used Ingle's Protestant background to his advantage, accusing Ingle of high treason against King Charles I, and said he could give evidence against Ingle for piratical and treasonable offenses. Ingle, unbeknownst to him, doesn't realize that this is going on. He is arrested, held without bond, and had his goods and ship, the Reformation, seized. The sheriff, Edward Parker, is ordered to keep Ingle prisoner, which was not the easiest task because technically there was no prison within which to hold him. But basically, Parker was given very explicit instructions. One, under no circumstances are you to let Ingle out of your sight. He is imprisoned, right? Wherever you keep him doesn't matter, but he is imprisoned. Two, if you have to go around with Ingle somewhere, he is under no circumstances allowed to reboard his boat without express written permission from the acting governor. So two very clear rules. Ingle's not prisoner for long, however, and his escape is nothing short of brazen. It's not quite clear whether bribery was involved, although I think it was probably more politics, but a man named Cornwallis and a couple of councilmen came to the sheriff and claimed they had license to take Ingle. Parker, of course, is under the pretense that the acting governor must have issued Ingle's release since these three prominent officials had come to retrieve him. But he reports later that he went with the men to continue his watch over Ingle because, you know, that was rule number one, not to let Ingle out of his sight. They head out, but the councilmen take Ingle to his ship, which he boards. So now Parker has violated all the rules, failed at sheriff. He then orders, Ingle then orders Parker and his men to lay down their arms and to get lost, which according to the sheriff, they really had no choice because when they came on board to re-arrest Ingle, it turned out a number of Ingle's men were already on board the ship waiting for them and beat the ever-loving tar out of them. And even though multiple other juries were ultimately convened in an attempt to arrest and convict Ingle, all of them failed when each jury came back with a finding of insufficient evidence to prosecute. The governor makes one final attempt to seize Ingle, issuing a warrant for his arrest on the grounds that he had assaulted a man named Bishop. Nobody can figure out who this guy was, probably just another political ploy, but when threatened with arrest, Ingle reportedly said he would destroy the homes of local residents, including Cornwallis, who had helped in his release, Brent, etc. But Ingle was still officially charged with piracy, mutiny, trespass, contempt, and misdemeanors. So if Ingle hadn't been a pirate before, he was certainly going to become one now. Of course, Ingle tells an entirely different story. In his petition to Parliament in 1645, he reminds them, you guys actually issued me a letter of marque last year, which grants me the authority to seize the goods and ships of any royalist vessels. That technically made him a privateer. And additionally, Ingle said he believed, based on the oath that he swore, that he was bound to aid any Protestants who were affected by tyrannical rule. And he said when he voyaged through Maryland, he found just that. The government of Maryland had been granted commissions from the crown to seize the goods and ships of vessels belonging to Parliament and their supporters. And so Ingle claimed that he saw his fellow Protestants oppressed and threatened by a, quote, tyrannical governor and the papists and malignants, his adherents. And that he actually risked his life and fortune to assist Parliament against such tyranny. And he went so far as to say that it pleased God to enable him to take from the papists their worldly possessions. And basically accused these people of conspiring against him with fictitious accounts of treason and piracy, and encouraged Parliament to take action, basically saying that if Parliament didn't step in, that it would set a dangerous precedent, allowing people to make these types of false allegations against those fighting on behalf of Parliament. But regardless of whose version you believe, nearly 2 years of piracy and hardship befall Catholic Maryland in a period known as the plundering time. There's no settled government at this point to put a stop to piratical incursions, and Ingle isn't done yet. He made good on his promise to try to pillage the property of the various officials. He pillages and burns the property of Cornwallis, for example, taking everything from account books to silverware, hogs to tobacco to furniture, whatever it was. If it wasn't nailed down or couldn't be easily pried up, they took it. But Ingle's depredations don't last forever. With the help of the Virginians and Governor Berkeley, Governor Calvert is able to assemble enough men and guns in late 1646 to retake St. Mary's and sort of reclaim the colony against these Protestant plunderers. But of course, Calvert's success means an end to Ingle's. But it's not all bad for the area, right? My other favorite story from the era is of Edward Davis, Peter Cloyce, Lionel Delawafer, and John Hinson. And if you ever watched the Golden Girls, picture it, the Chesapeake, June 16. 4 men are making their way down the Chesapeake in an unassuming shallop, this little light sail. They were not alone. They were accompanied by a treasure trove of goods in this tiny little boat. Davis, for example, had with him 3 bags of Spanish pieces of 8, 142 pounds of broken silver, silk stockings, expensive linens. Delawafer and Hinson, fairly similar, lots of, again, pieces of 8, lots of silver, the goods ultimately being totaled at a value of over 2,300 pounds. So how did these men come to have such a wealth of belongings? Well, it turns out they were former associates of South Sea buccaneer John Cook, and their exploits on the Revenge were chronicled in William Dampier's A New Voyage Around the World. Now, the men plundered their way through the South Seas even after Cook was killed from illness in the spring of 1684. But after a while, they decided their exploits, they were done. It's a harsh life out there in the South Seas as a pirate. So they, having come back frequently to the Chesapeake to refit their vessels and replenish their supplies, the men decided to retire from their life of seaborne crime and live the rest of their lives in peace and comfort in the Chesapeake. Unfortunately for them, King James had recently renewed his predecessor's proclamation against piracy. And basically, this was an attempt to eradicate the issue of piracy in the West Indies. The Crown at the time commissions a man named Sir Robert Holmes, placing his authority above that of the English colonial governors in the area, which is a problem since most of the earlier pirates had gotten off on their charges because of complicity with these colonial governors. Now you've got somebody whose authority is greater than theirs, whose sole job is to arrest pirates, and Holmes is able to retain any profits he or his agents seize from pirates, so they have a financial or economic incentive to basically find everybody guilty of piracy. Now, as these men are making their way down the Chesapeake, Holmes is passing by, and he's immediately suspicious when he witnesses these rather large chests on board and orders them to stop. Of course, upon further inspection, he seizes the men and their goods under suspicion of piracy and immediately ships them all to Jamestown. Now, at this point, the men are being independently interrogated by members of the council in Virginia. Of course, Wafer and Hinson denied having known Davis for very long. Basically, they're like, oh, we just encountered each other in Bermuda. We were all just kind of making our way back after some commercial ventures. Wafer and Hinson, of course, also deny being privateers. They're like, we were never in the South Seas. You can't prove that. Wafer, for example, claimed he had spent the last several years in the West Indies, and that, okay, yes, sometimes he did trade with the Spanish, which was technically illegal. He claimed all the goods that had been seized from him had actually been bequeathed to him from a friend in Lynnhaven. Unfortunately for the men, it would be the testimony of Peter Cloyce, who was the only Black man on board the boat, that would spell trouble for the men and undermine all of their denials. According to Cloyce's testimony, all of the men had been plundering together for many years, and they had become fabulously wealthy as a result. Of course, one has to wonder how much of Cloyce's admission was coerced, given that he was the only Black man on board and interrogated. Regardless, the men begin to slightly alter their stories. And if you're a fan of true crime, you know the moment you change your story, you're guilty. Just automatically stick to your story. Don't change it. But they claim that, you know, okay, yes, maybe we did do the odd piracy here and there, but when we went between Pennsylvania and Maryland, we actually secured certificates of immunity from Captain Thomas Allen of the HMS Quaker, and that Holmes had ignored those certificates of immunity, but their cries were of no use, and the men are detained in Jamestown. Now, fortunately for them, a lawyer named Micaiah Perry caught wind of their plight in the local newspaper and believed he could get the men out of jail based on the proclamation's caveat, which was if a pirate or privateer surrendered within 18 months of the proclamation, they would receive full and gracious pardons from the king. Now, of course, the governor and Holmes are saying, well, it's clearly evident these men have been pirates for a long time, and their insistence of their innocence means that they could receive the king's pardon. And for the men, they were very reluctant to accept this caveat because if they admitted to their piracy in that way, it would have meant the forfeiture of all of the goods and silver they'd acquired. But their lawyer convinces them, hey, give up the innocent act, apply for the pardon, because either you continue your act of innocence in the hopes of keeping your goods, but you're found guilty and you die. You don't get to keep your goods because you're dead. Or you can go on living, and yes, you might lose your goods, but you at least have your life, and maybe you can go steal some more stuff. So while the men are still concerned about their valuables, they take their lawyer's advice. Very smart. But they did continue to petition for the restoration of their confiscated goods, promising to give 300 pounds to what was then the college at Virginia. Now, as government officials are bickering back and forth about the political rulings regarding the pardons, the division or return of the seized goods, etc., the men continued to languish in jail. And ultimately, it took them 3 years and a trip to England before they got back even a fraction of what they'd started with. Of course, in the years that had passed, most of the loot had been picked over by various officials. It was lost during various movements of the goods. But even still, kudos to these guys. They were good on their word, and they delivered the 300 pounds they promised to what is now the College of William and Mary. And so I say to the College of William and Mary, huge lost, missed opportunity to have pirates as your mascot. College of William and Mary, founded by pirates. Perfect mascot, but that's just me. And with that, I want to leave some time for questions. You can also find me at my website, via email, and on Blue Sky, as I've lost my life on the Twitter sphere.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodall. That's a fascinating topic, and we really appreciate you joining us. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or use the hand raise function, which is down there under the heart at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
Promise I don't bite, and there are no stupid questions.
Also, Dr. Goodall has a book on Pirates of the Chesapeake, and I'm going to put that link in the chat right now as well. Sorry, we didn't mention that in the bio in the beginning.
Yes, if anybody manages to get a copy of my book, if you email me or message me through my website, I will send you a free signed book plate sticker since I couldn't be there in person to sign a copy. Or if you want to buy the book directly from me, you can also email me and I can facilitate that as well. I do have some extra copies still.
I'm gonna take a kind of administrative privilege here and ask a question myself. do you study or have any insights into modern day piracy and its prevalence? I know that it's not like the golden age, as it were, but where in the world that is, more of a problem, and what the kind of pedigree of the people that are engaged in it now are. Is it also people that are coming from, some kind of means originally, or is it more people that are just kind of desperate and trying to make a go of it however they can?
Well, so there's three sort of prominent hotspots right now. And actually, if I can remember to send you the link, anybody who's interested, there's a world map that is kept up to date with good regularity, that shows you like instances as they occur globally. And probably the most prominent that people are familiar with today is the area off the coast of Somalia. So east coast of Africa, that is a prominent hotspot. A lot of that has to do with the commercial shipping lanes that run through that area. Another is in parts of East Asia, the waterways in that area. Again, a lot to do with the commercial shipping lanes in that area. And then the third major hotspot right now, which is actually more tied to human trafficking and drug trafficking, is in the Gulf of Mexico. And so who participates it varies sort of depending on where you are, but I would say the piracy that's occurring off the coast of Somalia and in parts of East Asia, the people who are participating are coming from the lower rungs of the economic ladder. They are more desperate, but that some of these, especially off the coast of Africa, some of them are being financed by political groups. There's a lot of political and economic instability in those areas. And so you're getting, I hesitate to call them warlords, but that's kind of how they've been described in the news. But these warring factions, they'll be the ones financing these operations. And then, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico, in terms of human trafficking and drug trafficking, a lot of that's being driven by cartels, which, again, they're using desperate people to their advantage, but they're also, cartels are families and groups that are highly organized, have a lot of money and power at their disposal. So it's sort of this mixed bag in these areas. Their targets are also different. Of course, in the Gulf of Mexico, what we're seeing is a lot of targets against private yachts and personal vessels, because they believe these people have goods, valuables, cash on board that can supplement their trafficking efforts. Whereas off the coast of Somalia, of course, there, if you've seen the Captain Phillips movie, where you're getting these large container vessels, because they're typically holding people for ransom. Ransom is where they're really making their money in that region. I would say one of the only key differences between historical piracy and modern piracy is just the level of technology that they have at their disposal, communication devices, the types of weaponry that they're able to use, of course. But largely, the whole concept of stealing goods and holding people for hostage, holding people for ransom, historical pirates did that as well. Blackbeard, for example, had a very infamous encounter where he held a boatload of prominent Charleston plantation owners and merchants hostage in order to get money or medicine sent to his boat. And he, facilitates this great trade of, I'll give you these prominent people back if you send me this medicine. So of course they're like, absolutely, we've got to get you this medicine. He does send the prominent officials and people back, but he makes them row back to shore themselves naked. Humiliation was a key for Blackbeard. And I think that's true of modern pirates. There's a lot of humiliation that's tied to their activities as well. So I would say that those are the three hotspots currently, and their targets.
Okay, thank you. Well, are there any other questions out there? I don't see any raised hands. And none in the chat. So just to recap then, the link for Dr. Goodall's book is in the chat for those that are interested. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Goodall, for sharing your expertise with us. Oh, and she's just dropped her email in the chat also, another way to reach her. And as Brian mentioned at the top of our session, our next speaker series event will be on October 29th. So, and that's with Bob Stevenson, right?
Yeah, Eastport Library, 6 p.m. Wednesday, October 29.
We hope to see you all there to learn about the lighthouses of the Chesapeake. Thank you all for joining us.